to If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship. Today's episode is about complex trauma, attachment, and the healing power of relationship. Complex trauma work can feel overwhelming at first because the symptoms often extend far beyond what we traditionally associate with PTSD. Clients may struggle not only with intrusive memories or hypervigilance, but also with identity, shame, emotional regulation, trust, and relationships. And importantly, these responses should not be viewed as signs that someone is broken. Many of the patterns we see in CPTSD are deeply intelligent adaptations to environments that were unsafe, unpredictable, neglectful, or emotionally overwhelming. One of the most important mindset shifts in trauma-informed work is moving away from the question, "What is wrong with you?" and toward, "What happened to you, and how did your nervous system learn to survive it?" This episode explores how attachment trauma shapes the nervous system, why relationships can feel both desperately wanted and deeply threatening, and why the therapeutic alliance itself often becomes the primary engine of healing. Traditional PTSD is generally associated with three major symptom clusters: re-experiencing, avoidance, and a persistent sense of threat. Clients may experience flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, an exaggerated startle response, or avoidance of reminders connected to the trauma. Complex PTSD includes all of those symptoms, but also adds what researchers call disturbances in self-organization. These include severe emotional dysregulation, chronic shame, a deeply negative self-concept, and profound relational difficulties involving trust, closeness, or intimacy. In many cases, CPTSD develops not from a single event, but from repeated interpersonal trauma, especially trauma occurring during childhood development, attachment formation, or emotionally dependent relationships. The trauma becomes woven into the person's sense of self and their relationships. Clients are often not simply afraid that something bad will happen. They may believe, "I'm bad. I am too much. I am unsafe to love. People might hurt me if I become vulnerable." And that distinction matters clinically because treatment is not only about reducing fear responses, it's also about rebuilding safety, dignity, identity, connection, and trust. It is also important to note that although CPTSD is not currently a standalone diagnosis in the DSM-5-TR, it is formally recognized in the ICD-11, which is the diagnostic manual that is used internationally. Many trauma researchers also argue that human suffering cannot always fit neatly into rigid diagnostic categories, especially when developmental trauma impacts the entire nervous system, attachment system, and sense of self across a lifetime. One of the most transformative perspectives in trauma work is understanding symptoms as adaptations rather than defects. The nervous system is trying to protect the person. If a child grows up in an environment where love, safety, or emotional attunement are inconsistent or dangerous, the brain adapts around survival. The amygdala becomes highly sensitized. The attentional system becomes organized around scanning for danger. Many trauma survivors become extraordinarily perceptive of subtle facial expressions, tone shifts, tension changes, or emotional withdrawal. They may notice a slight change in someone's voice before the other person consciously registers it themselves. And while these adaptations may appear excessive in safe environments, they often developed in environments where reading danger accurately was not a preference, it was a necessity. The tragedy is that the nervous system learns connection may equal danger. This is especially true in disorganized attachment, sometimes called fearful attachment in adulthood. The child simultaneously needs closeness and fears the very person they depend on. Researchers often describe this as fright without solution. The protector is also the source of fear, and the nervous system becomes caught between two competing biological drives: move toward connection and move away from danger. In CPTSD specifically, trauma metabolizes into identity. The person does not simply feel bad about what happened to them. They believe that they are fundamentally defective. The survival brain is doing exactly what it is supposed to do to keep a human being alive in an active war zone. The tragedy is that the child is doing this in their own living room, and that sensitized alarm system becomes a lifelong companion. That conflict often continues into adulthood and enters the therapy room directly. Many survivors of complex trauma carry profound shame. Not shame about behavior, but shame about existence. They may believe they are fundamentally defective, burdensome, unlovable, or too much. And often these beliefs originated in environments where the child was blamed, ignored, emotionally abandoned, chronically criticized, or forced to suppress their needs in order to survive. This creates what some clinicians describe as a false self. Clients learn to become highly compliant, emotionally invisible, perfectionistic, hyper-independent, or constantly useful in order to preserve connection and reduce threat. But underneath that adaptation is often deep loneliness. Relational cultural theorists describe this as the central relational paradox. People long deeply for connection while simultaneously hiding their authentic selves out of fear that vulnerability will lead to rejection, humiliation, abandonment, or harm. So survivors may enter relationships wearing emotional armor. They show a version of themselves that is compliant or guarded. But this strategy only deepens their isolation because the connection that results is a connection to the armor and not to them. Therapy becomes frightening precisely because therapy asks for authenticity. Many clients are not afraid of talking, they are afraid of truly being seen. There's also profound grief in complex trauma work. Grief for the childhood that was never experienced safely. Grief for unmet needs. Grief for the self that had to disappear in order to survive. Healing often begins with grief that no longer has to be carried alone, and with the slow, embodied discovery that being seen does not have to end in devastation. Complex trauma does not occur in isolation. Trauma can be passed across generations, behaviorally, relationally, culturally, and even biologically. Research in epigenetics suggests that overwhelming stress can influence how certain genes related to stress regulation are expressed. This does not change someone's DNA itself, but it may alter how sensitized the nervous system becomes to danger and stress, shaping stress reactivity in the next generation before that child ever experiences their own adversity. We also see intergenerational trauma through attachment patterns, emotional communication, family roles, silence, neglect, addiction, violence, and unresolved grief. Parents with unresolved trauma may unintentionally struggle with emotional attunement, regulation, or consistency, not because they don't love their children, but because their own nervous systems were shaped by survival. The failure in attunement is not a moral failure. It is the continuation of a wound that was never given the conditions to heal. Some communities also carry what scholars and trauma researchers describe as historical trauma or soul wounds. And these are things that are connected to historical trauma like slavery or the Holocaust as examples. A trauma-informed and feminist lens reminds us that suffering does not happen in a vacuum. Social systems, inequality, discrimination, poverty, violence, and oppression shape mental health profoundly. This matters clinically because it shifts us away from individual blame and toward compassionate contextual understanding. Survivors do not exist in isolation from their families, their histories, their cultures, or the systems that shaped them. For clients with complex trauma, the relationship itself often becomes the intervention. Person-centered therapy emphasizes that the client is the expert on their own internal experience. The therapist's role is not to dominate, control, or interpret the client's reality for them. Instead, the therapist provides presence, authenticity, empathy, and emotional safety, a relational environment sturdy enough to hold whatever the client brings. Trauma-informed care similarly prioritizes physical and emotional safety, transparency, collaboration, empowerment, and the restoration of control. For many survivors, authority itself feels dangerous because the people who held authority over them were also the people who caused harm. So healing often requires creating a therapeutic environment where the client experiences genuine choice, respect, predictability, and partnership. Relational cultural theory extends this through the concept of fluid expertise. The therapist brings clinical knowledge, but the client remains the absolute expert on their own body, their own identity, and their own lived experience. The relationship must be genuinely collaborative. The client must be explicitly placed in charge of the pacing of the work. This also means that pacing matters enormously. A trauma-informed therapist does not force disclosure or aggressively push clients into traumatic material before the nervous system is ready. Sometimes the most therapeutic intervention is not deeper processing. It is helping the client feel safe enough to remain present in the room. And it is worth naming. Healing is often built through very small relational moments. Tone of voice, slowing down, reflecting feelings, allowing silence, validating emotional experience. These micro skills may seem simple, but for trauma survivors, they communicate something profound. You are safe. You make sense. You are not too much. You do not have to survive this alone. To truly understand why the therapeutic alliance is so fragile with CPTSD clients, we have to understand what trauma does to the body, because this is not primarily a cognitive story. It's a somatic one. Traumatic dissociation severs the neural connections between physiological arousal, emotion, cognition, and explicit memory. Think of it this way. The brain is an overheating computer. Too much data is flooding in. The emotional processing unit is about to melt down. So the brain physically unplugs the monitor so the hard drive can keep spinning in the dark. The sequential facts of who, what, when, and where get disengaged or hidden entirely. This allows the person to wake up the next morning, go to school, and function as though nothing happened. But the implicit memory, the raw sensory images, the emotional terror, the physical sensations of the trauma, these do not get filed away. They remain active. They remain alive in the nervous system. The sudden racing heart, the nausea, the muscle tension, the feeling of not being able to breathe, the wave of terror that arrives without warning. These are not random physical symptoms. They are memories. They are the literal physical expressions of trauma stored in the body, because the body remembers what the conscious mind desperately chose to forget. In more complex presentations, this can manifest as structural dissociation, which is a psychological division of the personality. There is the apparently normal part that goes to work, pays bills, and presents as functional. And then there are emotional parts that hold the traumatic memories, the terror, the shame, and the defensive responses. So a person can be sitting at a dinner party, appearing entirely composed, and then a specific scent drifts through the room, or someone makes a sudden movement, and the body reacts with sheer panic. The mind is separated from the event, but the body is not. Clinicians must track implicit cues carefully, so shallow breathing, emotional numbness, sudden politeness, freezing, dissociation, or abrupt emotional withdrawal. Rather than viewing these as resistance, trauma-informed clinicians understand them as protective nervous system responses. So grounding interventions, orienting to the room, slowing the pace, these things can help clients return to the present moment. Often the body needs safety before the mind can process the story. One of the most important findings in attachment research is that healing does not come from perfect attunement. Healing comes from repair. Misattunements will happen in every therapeutic relationship. The therapist may misunderstand something, forget something important, move too quickly, become emotionally distant, or unintentionally trigger shame or fear. What matters most is what happens next. When therapists acknowledge mistakes openly and non-defensively, something powerful occurs. The client experiences a different relational outcome than they expected. Instead of rejection or punishment or defensiveness, they experience accountability, repair, and reconnection. Researchers describe this as a prediction error. So the brain was braced for the familiar outcome and instead received something new. That moment, even though it seems small, begins to rewrite the internal working model of what relationships can be. This is one of the primary mechanisms through which earned secure attachment develops. The nervous system slowly learns. Conflict does not automatically equal abandonment. Disconnection can be repaired. Relationships can survive honesty. And for many trauma survivors, the therapeutic relationship may be one of the first emotionally corrective relationships they have ever experienced. In practice, repair follows a clear sequence. The therapist notices the rupture, often through subtle signals like mechanical politeness, sudden withdrawal, or becoming overly compliant. The therapist takes direct ownership without any excuses. They explore the injury together. How did my mistake land for you? And they bring transparency, sharing something of their own internal experience, risking being human, so the client can see that this relationship does not end when something goes wrong. So frequent relational meta-communication also supports alliance repair, pausing the content of the session to attend to the here and now of the relationship itself. If a client appears to withdraw or become guarded, a therapist might ask gently, "How are you experiencing me right now? Do I feel distant to you?" This helps clients slowly differentiate between their implicit predictions of betrayal and the therapist's actual behavior, gradually updating what they believe relationships are capable of. So, how do we build an alliance with someone whose entire relational history has taught them that vulnerability leads to devastation? When the client begins to experience the consistent care to test cautiously whether this relationship might actually be safe, what follows is what relational cultural theory calls a growth fostering relationship. The client learns not through logic, but through repeated embodied experience that it is possible to be seen, truly seen, and not destroyed. That need does not invite punishment. That vulnerability does not end in abandonment. That the armor can slowly and safely begin to come off. What it actually looks like to offer a genuinely healing relational experience to a CPTSD survivor. We've talked about shame, the deep somatic belief that one is fundamentally defective, too toxic, too broken to be held. The therapeutic relationship is at its core a sustained and repeated challenge to that belief, not through argument, not through cognitive reframing, but through experience, through the slow accumulated physical evidence that this relationship is different from every relationship that came before. This is why reflective supervision is not optional in complex trauma work. It's a clinical necessity. The supervisory relationship, when done well, mirrors what we are trying to provide our clients, a secure base, a space to be honest, to sit with difficulty, to repair one's own clinical blind spots without shame. Another important clinical insight is that warmth must sometimes be carefully calibrated. For some survivors, extremely intense or overly enthusiastic warmth can actually feel unsafe or inauthentic because, in their experience, intense warmth from an authority figure was a prelude to harm or manipulation. So sometimes a more grounded, steady, predictable presence may feel safer to some clients. The goal is not warmth that serves the therapist's own need to be liked. It's warmth that the client's nervous system can actually receive. And importantly, clients do not need perfection. What often matters most is the therapist's humanity, the willingness to be emotionally real, emotionally accountable, and emotionally present. Research from work with trafficking survivors found that profound turning points in healing sometimes occurred when a therapist showed genuine visible emotion in response to a client's story. Not performance, not clinical distance, but genuine human presence. For a person who had spent their entire life believing their pain was too toxic, too overwhelming for anyone to hold, a therapist's compassionate tears said what no technique could. You are not too much. What happened to you was a tragedy, and you are entirely worthy of care. Complex trauma treatment is not simply about symptom reduction. It is about helping people reclaim connection to their emotions, their bodies, their identities, their relationships, and their own sense of worth. Many survivors learned very early that vulnerability was dangerous, that needs were unsafe, that emotions were overwhelming, and that closeness came with pain. Therapy offers the possibility of a different experience, not through perfection, not through rescuing, and not through authority, but through consistency, attunement, collaboration, accountability, and repair. CPTSD can create lifelong patterns of craving closeness while fearing intimacy, mistrusting care, withdrawing, feeling emotionally fragmented during moments of connection. And it's worth saying again, these patterns are adaptations. They were intelligent survival responses developed in genuinely unsafe environments. When clinicians understand this, behaviors that might otherwise appear contradictory, difficult, or resistant begin to make much more sense, and they invite compassion rather than frustration. It is important to remember you do not need flawless words or perfect techniques to be healing. Very often, what clients remember most is whether they felt emotionally safe, whether they felt believed, whether they felt respected, and whether someone stayed emotionally present with them when things became difficult. There's a phrase from the clinical literature that I'll leave you with. It describes trauma treatment not from the vantage point of the textbook, but from what researchers call the view from the trenches, the willingness to stay connected when connection feels like a threat. That is what this work asks of us. Not perfection, not the absence of rupture, just the willingness to stay, to be moved, to repair, to remain, even when the client's every instinct is bracing for the moment we don't. At its core, trauma therapy is deeply human work. And sometimes healing begins the moment a survivor realizes, my reactions make sense. I am not defective, and I no longer have to survive alone. For every clinician doing this work, thank you for staying. Thank you for joining me on If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship. Until next time.